The value of digital credentialing has grown significantly over the years. They serve as verifiable proof that a learner has completed a course, and they can motivate learners to succeed and grow in their roles. But there's a lot to consider before you develop a digital credentials program.
So I think it's a really important question because to me, digital credentials, there's still a lot of complexity that goes into designing a digital credentialing system. And so I think you need to ask yourself, at the beginning, what is the purpose of me using digital credentials? And what is the value of this for the people that are earning them and then the people that are going to be viewing them?
That's Torrie Raish, a digital credentials expert, who will break down all you need to know about building a successful credentialing program. Next on Powered by Learning.
Powered by Learning is brought to you by Vinci Interactive. Da Vinci's approach to learning is grounded in 30 years of innovation and expertise. We use proven strategies and leading technology to develop solutions that empower learners to improve quality and boost performance. Learn more at davinci.com.
Joining me today is Da Vinci's Director, Learning Experience, Jenny Fadulo, and our guest, Victoria Raish. Torrie is a senior leader in the field of online learning and microlearning, and she's going to share her knowledge about digital credentialing. Welcome, Torrie.
Hi, Torrie. Great to be with you today.
Thank you for having me.
Torrie, let's start out by giving our listeners an idea of your background and experience in the instructional design and ed tech areas.
Yeah, so I have been involved in online learning since 2010, and I've really had every role within online learning, from being a learner in various online learning platforms to being an instructional designer, a consultant, program director, a senior leader of online learning and digital credentials, a research assistant, faculty member, really in all facets of online learning, both from learning in an online learning system to delivering the online learning. I've really, spent all of my professional time in some capacity with learning, education, training, online learning, digital credentials, and microlearning. So I've published several articles in this space, both peer-reviewed and then just popular articles that you can find online. And I've consulted with a variety of levels of organizations and individuals, from just individuals who are looking to build online courses all the way up to nonprofits and corporations who are looking to either design training or to attempt to be more innovative and sort of at this forefront in this intersection between higher ed, corporate learning, and innovation. So that's the space that I really like to play in. So I think just a bit about me to get a sense of my personality is I got tenure at Penn State University and I quit the next month after getting tenure to join a startup who we deliver online learning degrees and have some digital credentials as well. And our primary learner population comes from emerging countries. So we have a tuition dependent on GDP and are looking to scale and use technology as much as possible so that we continue offering low-cost degrees that are actually fully OER as well. And so that's, I think, a sense of my risk-taking and where I like to be in terms of growing and building things, and then looking for the next thing to grow and build.
Well, this is definitely a next thing, and so many of our listeners want to learn more about digital credentialing. So we're excited to hear your stories and your best practices.
Yeah, Torrie, for sure. I mean, just your background. Susan and I were like a kid in a candy store trying to figure out where we should focus this podcast. So we appreciate it. So yeah, we did land on digital credentialing. So curious, our listeners might think of, traditional degrees or badging or certifications. Mm-hmm. What can you explain just what are digital credentials and how do they differ from traditional degrees or certifications?
Yeah, I think, you mentioned badges earlier. So I think that a lot of people will equate digital credentials to digital badges and call them one and the same, which I think is pretty common in the field. So when I say digital credential, digital badge, or open badge, to me, they're all interchangeable terms. They sometimes means different things technically, but we won't really get too much into the details of that today. So I think if you look at the landscape of those, and if you look at things like the Credential engine or IMS Global / now EdTech One, and what they are doing with digital credentials and really developing the technology standards around them. They're, in some ways they're similar to degrees, right? They're still recognizing learning. They're still capturing learning. I like to think of them as actually the most powerful digital credentials, in my opinion, are capturing previously unrecognized learning. And so there's this idea of digital credentials, and it's from way back in 2013, actually. Ruginis wrote an article. It was for a conference, an ICM conference, like a IT conference. And in that article, he called digital credentials or digital badges talkative objects with tails and conditionalities. And those are, when I think about digital credentials, that article, even though I've read and watched and been in conversations with a lot of people in the space for a long time, that article always comes to my mind because it's really what you're providing when you issue a digital credential to somebody, whether it's training or learning or development, is you're giving them articulated points about their learning, and you're structuring the learning in a way that makes it clear for people what the goal of the learning is, what you're designing, and what you need to do to get there, right? Because it's really in a micro-learning space. What you do lose is a bit of the bigger context and the bigger connection between things. But what you gain is this intricate level of detail at a smaller scale, at a more granular scale that helps people articulate points that they might not have thought of before. So a good example, I think, is I had the opportunity to speak to an employer panel who goes to, universities to recruit talent. And there's questions, and the technology has come a long way in terms of like what can be read on resumes, and that's not like my extreme area of expertise. But that question and asking employers if they'd be willing to evaluate credentials, or are employers using credentials for their employees, those kinds of things. Those are important questions, right, at a scale level. But I thought what was really interesting was in that meeting with these employers, there was somebody from Johnson & Johnson, and obviously they're evaluating a lot of talent all the time. And they said, when I go to these career fairs at universities, there might be 15 learners who come up and talk to me, and 15 students, and I want to hear about their leadership expertise. That was just an example. And 14 of them will say the same group project, and that nobody else in the group did their job, and they came together and they saved the group, and they built healthy group team dynamics, and it's not very memorable. And the learners sort of struggle to make a point. Whereas if you were going to give somebody a leadership experience and recognize it through a badge, you're naturally, as long as you're designing the badge well, you're naturally building in some articulation points, building in that cognitive dissonance at the beginning for them to recognize, that they're really focused on leadership here, and this is what we're focused on with leadership. And then you give them some reflection and some transfer after the fact. If somebody came with that, not only would it stick out because it's different, but it would show initiative, and it would show that somebody is able to clearly communicate their points. In terms of differing from a traditional degree, that granularity, I think, is important. And the digital nature of digital credentials, I think, is also important, right? Because this is also like a potential challenge that we'll get to later, but the ability to store the data digitally and really to give learners ownership of their data is very different than traditional degrees, where you might still need to go through the registrar and request this transcript or request that transcript, and you're looking at a high-level overview and summary of that person, and you don't really know what the classes are. It's not clear what the classes are. There's not a lot of metadata behind it. You sort of trust the degree that it's preparing the learner. And so when you get into digital credentials, really you give the learner ownership and portability over their credentials and allow them to package their learning and represent it in ways that they can't do with a traditional transcript.
I was thinking about how we're digital credentialing, how could they benefit the learners and employers? And I think you just touched on that a little bit. Can you elaborate a little bit further?
Yeah. So I think that there is, a lot of ways actually that it could benefit the learner or the employer. And I think it depends on, what you're looking for and what your use case are. And I talked a bit about already, like this recognizing unrecognized learning.
Right.
The other thing that you can do is really stack your learning. So from a learner perspective, let's say that you are going to pursue a bachelor's degree, but you don't finish it. You can use, if you are pursuing digital credentials, you at least have some artifact of the effort that you've made in certain spaces, even if you don't complete a full degree. So it recognizes some learning at a smaller level. So it gives you some stackable credentials. It also allows you to then pursue additional credentials based on what you've already learned. And I think, particularly in fields that don't have recognized credentials, when I was at Penn State, we did most of the badging research we did was actually around employer perceptions of digital credentials, and particularly what industries are more interested in digital credentials and what industries aren't as interested. And I think it's sort of intuitive, but industries like teaching or medical that already have like recognized pathways to being certified and getting exams and getting their professional licensing and those sorts of things. Digital credentials, while they could still have a space there if you're teaching other things like power skills, they're not necessarily super needed in those fields because there are already recognized pathways. But then when you go into other fields like manufacturing and IT, there's natural interest in finance as well. There's natural interest in digital credentials because those types of established, certs and state exams and whatnot aren't necessarily there in those spaces. And so it gives the learner ownership of their learning, and it gives the employer greater insight into additional learning that perhaps was unrecognized and unverified before that person has.
I can see some applicability in sales and marketing. Would you agree that might be of a market that there would be interest?
Yeah. I think sales and marketing, advertising as well, product development, like
right.
a huge.
That's what I was thinking.
A huge into product development as well. Yeah. I think there's a lot of space for it in any of the industries where there's a struggle with recruiting talent and getting people with the right skill sets and knowing what those right skill sets are, particularly when maybe they didn't major in a field related to what they want to go into, or the field is changing so quickly that you have to constantly level up to show that you are like keeping up in the field and you know what you're doing. So like even in engineering, you might get an engineering degree, but then, you come back 2 years later as an alumni and everything is like a lot of things have changed in the field. So instead of going back and getting a full degree again, you just focus on these short courses recognized with digital credentials or PDFs or whatever you want to recognize them with. And then you maintain your relevance and your professional development as well. So it's helpful for, students in college. It's also helpful for people that are going back to get additional training, to upskill, all that kind of stuff.
Understood. Okay. So those on the call listening, what they're like, yes, I'm bought in. I get it. I understand what it is. I understand the benefits. Where do they start? What are the key steps and considerations involved in establishing a program?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I think part of it depends on like who you are, because the questions that you're going to ask, well, obviously there's strategy questions and there's logistic questions and detailed questions and what system are you going to use? Like those questions exist for everybody. But I think what questions you really focus on depends on who you are, right? Because if you're somebody in K-12, you're going to have different questions than somebody in higher ed that's going to have different questions than somebody in corporate, right? So like somebody in K-12 might be focused on, how these digital credentials could increase equity. They might also be focused on how the digital credentials can help meet state standards or where they fit into standardized tests, or, digital credentials can go on the Common App. So how are we putting them on the Common App for learners? And then you get to like higher ed, and obviously you have to worry about accreditation and you have to worry about faculty senate and approval of curriculum. And the registrar has a huge role to play at the higher ed level in terms of issuing these credentials, because I'm sure some people on the call are going to chuckle at this, but there's countless examples of professors just printing certs off their printer in their office and giving them to learners, and it not really coming from a registrar or anything like that. And then learners will go back to that institution and say like, oh, I want this XYZ certificate. It came from Professor, ABC's desk, and the registrar has like no record of that, right? So the registrar has to get involved too. And then if you're talking about corporate, you have more a bit more like innovation and less accountability to accreditation or those sorts of things. But then you have to worry a bit more, I think, about like budget and revenue and employee like growth pathways and why are you using digital badges. So I think some of those fundamental questions about why you want to do this depend on who you are. But then once you get into the space, I think there's very common things that you need to figure out. Like you need to figure out what your purpose of the digital credentials are. You need to figure out how you're going to design the digital credentials, and the design factors a lot into, how much capacity do you have for assessment? Mm-hmm. Do you need to scale the assessment? Is it going to be manual assessment? What is the evidence that you're going to generate, right? Because that's really like one of the powerful things of digital credentials is that an employer can click on them and see exactly what the evidence is. There's metadata there, so they can see exactly what the learner or their employee or whatever did in relation to that digital credential. And so, like, how are you going to verify that evidence? How are you going to store the evidence? Where does it show up for the learner? Those are all important questions from a design perspective. And obviously, you have your own beliefs about what instructional design model you use and what training needs analysis you use. So that's standard no matter what kind of learning object you're creating, right? Like if you're creating a full course or a digital credential, like those kind of questions are relatively common. But then when you think about credentials, some of the other things are like, is this going to generate revenue for us? What kind of resources do we need to put into this? How is it going to get adopted? What's our adoption going to look like? Which is like a critical question, right? Because you could build something, there might be a need for it, but if you don't have a plan for marketing it and getting it into the hands of the people that want it, then it doesn't make any sense, right? So like, I think IBM has done a great job of designing digital credentials that map to actual jobs within IBM, that if somebody wants to get that, next position, they're already at IBM, they know that if they pursue these digital credentials, it increases their attractiveness to the job that they want to get, right? So like that's an obvious incentive to complete a digital credential is to like level up and grow in your career. But if you don't have it tied to career pathways, then really like what are the incentives behind somebody completing a digital credential? Like what's the value that the people place on it, and how are you going to communicate that value both internally and externally? And then, deciding what digital credential system to use, I think is another big starting point, right? So there's
a bunch on the market.
There's a bunch on the market, yeah. And I think this number is not exactly accurate, but there's around 23 digital credentialing systems that are EdTech 1 approved. So that means that they meet the open badge technical portability, which is really important because otherwise you're just picking a system where the badge just lives within that system and it can never go anywhere else. So, that would be something like you would be issuing a badge like, I don't know, in Code Academy or something like that. That's an example of like a closed badge. It's not going to go anywhere else. It stays within that system, like Squarespace, that app, those kinds of things. Or like, I don't know, Call of Duty or whatever that issues badges. There's those kind of badges, but we're talking about badges that need to be portable and be able to go to different systems, whether you migrate or the learner keeps their learning and migrates it somewhere else. So you need to make sure that it is an EdTech 1 certified system. And then from there, obviously, all of the systems have different pros and cons. So you have to do your appropriate vendor evaluation of the systems and decide from a cost perspective and from a design feature perspective, which system makes the most sense to you, which is going to fit for what you're doing. And then, of course, you have to ask questions then around, once you're done with, all that stuff, like what the implementation looks like, how you're going to onboard people, how you're going to educate people around what this digital credential means, what the value is, how they can communicate what they've learned, how they can communicate the digital credential, what the visibility is. Then you come to evaluation. How are you going to evaluate the success of what you do in your program? How are you going to iterate? Do you have a maintenance plan? Because, when you talk about digital credentials, like they are digital. So do you have an expiration date on them, right? So like if you're going to issue a digital badge for first aid, it's like an obvious example. Obviously, you need to have an expiration date because your first aid license doesn't last forever. So, you have your CPR and first aid badge, and you can, let's say that you, in the summer work as a lifeguard or whatever, you can show that you already have it, right? Like you have this credential and you can produce it. But obviously it has to expire at a certain point in time because you don't remember first aid and CPR, and the whatever breathing numbers change and those kinds of things.
Right.
So you have to get recertified, right? So do you have an expiration date around your digital credential? And if somebody like wants to earn it, do they have to pay for it, or is it just included as part of their role within your company? So there's all sorts of questions, and what do you want to capture with digital credential, like training, basic training needs questions as well. So
no, these are all great considerations. Absolutely.
When you think about all those questions, if you're a corporation maybe thinking about this for internal purposes, or an organization maybe looking to credential external audiences, how do you work through all of those questions, all that whole process, sometimes not even knowing what the questions are, and to try to evaluate whether you're better off sticking with some sort of internal PDF of a certificate versus taking this leap?
Right. Yeah. It's a really important question, right? And I've talked to a lot of people about digital credentials, met with a lot of different people when I was at Penn State who worked in different departments, met with a lot of people outside of Penn State, because for like 4 years I was co-chair of IMS's Global Innovation Learning Network around digital credentials. So we would meet in person and meet online to talk about, important issues that we were seeing in the space, people that were actively in the space, right? So I think it's a really important question, because to me, digital credentials, even if you don't have to deal with, like, let's say the accreditation issues or the faculty senate control at the higher ed level, and you have more flexibility in that, there's still like a lot of complexity that goes into designing a digital credentialing system. And so I think you need to ask yourself, like at the beginning, what is the purpose of me using digital credentials? And what is the value of this for the people that are earning them, and then the people that are going to be viewing them? I think a lot of it really comes down. And if you look at in 2015, Dan Hickey et al. Wrote a white paper about really what's been learned in the digital badging space. And I think it's still relevant today. And if you look at that paper, it talks about like the successes and the failures and where digital credentials succeeded. And it looks at the 30 grant recipients from the Mozilla and MacArthur Foundation. So it looks at like who succeeded and who didn't, and why they succeeded and why they didn't. And over and over again, you'll see that it comes down to, what's your purpose of using these? Why are you going to use them? What's the value of using these? Are they, just a participation badge, or is there additional value behind issuing these in some way that we're previously doing a disservice to people by not offering something like this, right? So like some clubs or whatever might issue badges to try to incentivize people to join, like, oh, if you earn 5 badges, you'll get discount on this or discount on that, right? And so like that's one level of importance. But then also, you could be more interested in verifying. You're having difficulty verifying, and so like you can use digital credentials to verify skills or to endorse people in certain areas. They're particularly good for recognizing things like power skills, and like I said, stuff that's previously sort of been like unrecognized or just assumed or implicit as a competency in people.
A lot of considerations, but yeah, I love the summary there at the end with the key points that you made. That's super, super helpful. Artificial intelligence, everyone's talking about it, every industry. What about here? How is AI being utilized to enhance the digital credentialing process?
Yeah, I think AI is being used in all aspects of digital credentialing, from creation to assessment to verification and evaluation and endorsement of what the credentials are. And then obviously AI is also being used in other systems that digital credentials feed into, like human resource evaluation systems, like applications, everything like that, right? Where AI is being used. And so literally I wouldn't be able to survive without using AI for my own work. Like I couldn't get anything done at the speed that I have to get it done. Like it saves so much time and allows you to focus on, more creative and complex things that you need to do. So I think, if you're talking about design of credentials, AI can certainly help with what your objectives are, what your outline is, what your assessment measures might be, using prompts to come up with different options for a hierarchy of digital credentials, because we haven't even talked about that. But if you're going to issue more than one credential, you're going to have a pathway for somebody. And so what does that pathway look like? What makes the most sense? You can use artificial intelligence to help you organize all of those thoughts. But then also, you can use artificial intelligence, obviously, to help verify the credentials, right? So there's a question, like a running question and a skeptical question from people about, how do we know that this is legitimate? How do we know that this is, verified? And so there was talk for a long time about blockchain being used to help verify and do trust enablement. And I think AI is rapidly involved in that space as well, in terms of that verification and endorsement space. And then obviously you can also use AI for assessment and evaluation of your credentials. So when I was at Penn State, we developed an AI called Text on Target, and it was used at the evaluation level because when I was at Penn State, we actually had a bit of a unique situation in that we had developed our own digital credentialing system, digital badging system, and it's no longer used, but for mostly technology security reasons and just the upkeep on systems like that, and the tendency of higher education to just choose external vendors now instead of building things in-house. And so we developed this tool called Text on Target because Penn State's digital badging system was also a content management system, which you don't see in, I don't think, any other digital credentialing system. And so we could actually so most credentialing systems just house the evidence and the steps and issue the credentials, but we could actually build what the learner had to do. Like they submitted text boxes or files or these sorts of things into the digital credentialing system. So we were evaluating in the system, like actually providing feedback to learners. And so obviously that feedback, while it is, customized and answer specific questions, obviously it gets repetitive because you see this similar response over and over again, particularly when it's the most common response. And so this system, Text on Target, we analyzed all of the existing responses to specific steps and generated the most common response based on the data that was in there. And so then when you would go in to evaluate, it would already have a response there, and you would just have to customize it if you wanted to, or just approve what was in there. So it gave you suggested text, right? So it helps to augment and scale evaluations, right? So I think, there's that, isn't there that website, there's an AI for that? I think it's true, like here as well. And so, yeah, I'm sure the Credleys and the Badgers and the Canvas Badges of the world and the Accreditables are actively using AI in their work within their platforms. And then anything that you have to do with those key questions that I mentioned above, like AI can be used in any of those ways as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I know earlier you had mentioned a challenge. Can you elaborate more on what are some of those key challenges that those listening should think about when they're implementing a digital credentialing system? Yeah,
I think that there are definitely a lot of considerations to make when you're deciding if you want to go down this road and create or further your digital credentialing system or rethink how it's being used, right? I think we've already talked about this, but placing value on the credential, because you could create limitless credentials, right? And at some point you start depleting the value, minimizing the value of what you're doing and what it means to issue a credential to somebody. So you have to decide, do we have multiple levels of credentials? Do we have these pathways? Do they stack? What do we want to issue credential for? What's credential worthy? What's not, right? So there's all this question around value, and it's really up to you to build and communicate the value of your digital credential. And then I think there's considerations and challenges around external and internal stakeholders. So, if you're collaborating and partnering with somebody else, obviously there needs to be conversations around accepting digital credentials as evidence of learning. You have to make sure that you're investing, the appropriate resources. And if you're investing together or building together, is there shared revenue? Is there shared investment? What does the strategic alignment look like with everybody involved in the digital credentialing platform? What sort of human capital are you going to invest into it as well? And then when you get to, verifying and endorsing, you have to think about, what do your assessments look like? What does the evidence look like that's provided? What kind of evidence that a learner submits is going to be acceptable? So do you have rubrics that somebody needs to follow, or is it going to be relatively easy to earn the credential and rubrics aren't needed? So you have to think about how you're going to verify and issue a credential to somebody. If you decide that somebody doesn't receive the credential because they haven't met the established criteria, can they try again, right? Or do they have to do something before they can try again? So once you get into the weeds, there's all these additional questions that pop up. And then you have to ask yourself about integration with existing systems. So once you pick the technology, the badge issuing platform you want to use, is your content stored somewhere else? How does that connect? If you're a higher education institution or K-12, how does it connect to your student information system? How does it connect to your grading system and how transcripts are issued? If you are an employer or you're designing them for professional development for your staff, does it relate to your internal, HR platforms? Do you need a CRM to keep track of, customer relationship management, all those sorts of things? What are the policies and procedures? Are there application systems and other HR systems that you need to be aware of? Like, does it incorporate with, for example, Workday or all of those sorts of things? So any of the SaaS software. So I think that there is like a lot of consideration with integration with existing systems. But if you pick a platform that is EdTech 1 certified, then you at least know that you've picked a technology that is capable of the integration, and hopefully your other systems are as well.
Right. So you don't have all those other questions or considerations to worry about if you know that you've picked the right platform. Absolutely.
Right.
What do you envision for the future of digital credentialing? Where's it going to be in 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I don't exactly know where it's going to be in 5 to 10 years. I'm not Brian Alexander, but I think that, if you were going to think about where digital credentials are going to be, I think that the money that's going into digital credentials right now is a lot. And if you look at like the digital credential engine, for example, they have great stats up front. For example, they have, stats around training investment, right? So there's like nearly 60,000 credential providers across the U.S., and over $2.13 trillion is spent in education and training. And there's been issued over 1.076 million credentials in the U.S. And those are just the ones that are stored in the credential engine, right? So that's not even all of the credentials that are out there. So I would say from that perspective, like it's only going to grow, because I think skills-based training, skills-based hiring, everything that's related to digital credentials, particularly in some industries, has been relatively slow to take off. Like people say that they're willing to hire this way and they're willing to look at things this way, but then the default is still transcripts and degrees because that's what people are familiar with. So I think, this alignment with skills-based, particularly where there's industry shortages or like short-term industry shortages, like in the microchip industry, there was like a ton of shortages or is a ton of shortages, but it's not necessarily a long-term problem. So I think looking at the labor industry and labor data and identifying these areas where micro-learning and shorter credentials can help, because obviously, like if you earn a whole degree in semiconductors, like you're behind the 8 ball already because something else has happened. So in these spaces where like technology is changing quickly, I think short courses, digital credentials, recognizing learning that way are going to become really important. And so I think, back in 2016, we asked employers how many would be willing to accept digital credentials, and only 5% said no, but there was like only 30% said yes. So there was like this very large maybe section. So also I would hope that over the next 5 to 10 years, the maybes turn more into yeses, and it just becomes a standard practice to evaluate credentials in really no matter what the industry is, to be willing to look at and evaluate credentials. So yeah, I would say that those are some of the ways that I think digital credentials are going to grow and evolve in the next 5 to 10 years. And then if I had to guess what was going to happen from a platform perspective, I would say we will not have like 23 to 25 platforms. I would say that they're going to merge and consolidate, and you're going to end up with just a few of the major players that dominate the market share. The same way with learning management systems. There's like a gazillion learning management systems, but there's only like a handful that are, known and regularly used by everybody. So I think that it will sort of evolve. The technology and the vendors and the companies that issue credentials will evolve like that. And then, I think there will still be the same challenges we talked about today are probably going to be there in 5 to 10 years, but hopefully we've solved some of them. And then some new challenges will crop up as like mass adoption and, like the innovation curve. So like as more and more people adopt digital credentials, obviously you'll maybe the needing to educate around what they are becomes less, but now everybody has them. So is it a diluted credential, and how do you then still upscale and differentiate yourself, right? So, and the equity questions I think remain as well and need to be at the forefront of everything related to digital credentials. So yeah, those are some of the ways that I think the industry is going to evolve in the next 5 to 10 years.
Torrie, there's so much to consider, obviously, but so many great opportunities. And I think people listening to this interview, you've moved a lot from the maybe column to the yes column. So thank you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing your insights.
Yeah, I enjoyed the conversation. It's a really fascinating topic. For sure.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about digital credentials today. I really enjoyed the conversation today.
There's certainly a lot to consider when starting a digital credentials program, Jenny.
Right. You're telling me what a lot of information. But I mean, it's clear after speaking with Torrie that the world of digital credentialing it's exciting and rapidly evolving. And I think it's clear that as we look to the future, digital credentials is going to really play a significant role in shaping, our workforce and how we measure learning or certify learning.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Jenny. And special thanks to our guest, Torrie Raish, for joining us today. If you have an idea for a topic or a guest, please reach out to us at poweredbylearning@davinci.com. And don't forget that you can subscribe to Powered by Learning wherever you listen to your podcasts.